What if I told you some spirits never left their graves, and tonight they might be watching you? If you love ghost stories, hit subscribe, tap like, and share this video so we can bring you even more terrifying tales. Subscribe, like, share to keep the ghosts coming. The mountains of Gunma Prefecture do not speak in words. They speak in mists and winds, in the creaking of ancient cedars, in the hush of snow when it falls like ash from the heavens. To the ordinary eye, they are beautiful, green, solemn, a wall of silence guarding the heart of Japan. Yet beneath their serenity lies a memory too violent to fade, a scar so deep that even the earth itself seems unable to heal. On the evening of August 12, 1985, a plane split the sky above these ridges. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a gleaming Boeing 747, carried 524 souls, businessmen, children, mothers, lovers, strangers pressed together in a great metal bird. Their voices, their laughter, their unspoken hopes, all lifted from Tokyo's Haneda Airport toward Osaka, toward home, toward destiny. But destiny is a cruel companion. It travels beside us silently, waiting for its moment to reveal its true face. Just 12 minutes into flight, the plane shuddered with a sound like the tearing of the world itself. A bulkhead ruptured, a tail tore apart. The gods of the air turned their eyes away, and for 32 minutes, a lifetime compressed into half an hour, the plane became a coffin suspended in the sky, carrying hundreds who knew they were already ghosts. At 6:56 p.m., the mountain received them. Steel and fire erupted across its ridge. Flames painted the trees, smoke choked the stars, and 520 voices rose in a single scream that did not end with death. It poured into the soil, into the roots, into the very veins of the mountain. That night, Gunma's silence was broken, and it has never been silent since. To speak of Flight 123 is to speak of a tragedy unmatched, the deadliest single aircraft disaster in human history. But beyond the statistics lies something else, something more enduring. The haunting. For in Japan, where the veil between the living and the dead is thin as rice paper, tragedies do not merely end, they echo, they fester, they breathe. Locals call the crash site Osutaka the Ridge of Osutaka. Even the name carries a weight, as if the mountain was baptized in sorrow. Villagers whisper that the ridge is no longer merely land, but a shrine of grief, where spirits linger like fog, refusing to ascend. The dead of Flight 123, they say, still wander there, caught between worlds, unable to leave. The story begins with the crash, yes, but it is more than that. It is about the whispers carried on the night wind, the lantern-like light seen drifting among the trees, the cries for help that rescue teams swore they heard long after the flames had died. It is about a mountain that remembers too much, and about the living who come too close and feel the weight of 520. Restless souls pressing against their skin. To understand the haunting, one must first understand Japan itself. This is a land where every stone may contain a spirit, where rivers are said to hold memories of the drowned, where ancestors are not gone but near, always watching, always listening. It is a land where the dead are not feared as strangers, but honored as family who linger just beyond the shoshi screen of reality. Yet when death comes violently, unnaturally, ripping souls from their bodies in fire and terror, those spirits do not rest. They cling, they cry, they demand. The ghosts of Flight 123 are not phantoms invented by frightened minds. They are a natural consequence of spiritual imbalance. Too many lives were severed at once, too many prayers cut short, too many voices left unfinished. Such energy cannot vanish. It pools in the soil, it shimmers in the mist, it coils around the trees like smoke. And when night falls, those who dare approach Osutaka Ridge know the mountain is alive with the dead. Imagine the mountain as it was that night. The forest burned, the trunks of cedar trees cracked by heat. The cries of survivors pierced the darkness, only to be swallowed by silence as hours crawled by without rescue. It was not until morning that helicopters spotted the wreckage, a jagged scar across the green, twisted metal glinting in the sun. The rescuers climbed, their boots sinking into ash and blood. They found bodies scattered among the wreckage, as if 1,000 dolls had been tossed carelessly across the slope. Some were charred, some intact, many still clutching belongings that had no meaning anymore. A child's toy, a crumpled letter, a wristwatch frozen forever at 6:56, and yet, The rescuers swore that as they worked, they felt they were not alone. One firefighter described the sensation of dozens of eyes watching from the tree line. Another claimed he heard faint voices calling his name, though no one around him spoke. A soldier later admitted that he could not sleep for weeks, haunted by dreams of faceless passengers reaching out with burned hands. This was not imagination. This was the mountain absorbing their fear, their confusion, their longing to live. The dead do not leave quietly when torn from the world so suddenly. They linger, desperate, attaching themselves to anything, to the soil, to the trees, to the rescuers who touched their broken bodies. In the years that followed, stories multiplied. Farmers near the ridge claimed they heard weeping at night, drifting down from the mountain like mist. Hikers reported seeing figures in business suits walking among the trees, only to vanish when approached. Taxi drivers spoke in hushed voices of passengers who requested rides to non-existent addresses, only to disappear from the back seat leaving behind the faint scent of smoke. At memorial services, families of the victims sometimes trembled as they lit incense. Some said they felt hands brush against theirs as they placed flowers. Others heard their loved ones' voices whispered on the wind, speaking words only they could understand. One monk, who climbed the ridge to perform purification rituals, described the atmosphere as unbearable. The air was thick, he said. It was as though hundreds of people were breathing beside me, pressing on my chest. When I began to chant, the trees themselves seemed to cry. This is the haunting of Flight 123, not a single ghost, not a single apparition, but an army of lost souls woven into the fabric of a mountain. They do not haunt as individuals. They haunt as a collective, a chorus of unfinished voices, forever replaying the night they fell. And yet, the story is not one of horror alone. It is also one of longing. Among the wreckage, letters were found, hastily written by passengers during those final 32 minutes of flight. Words scrawled on napkins, on envelopes, on scraps of paper. Farewells, confessions, desperate attempts to speak one last time to those waiting below. I'm sorry. Take care of the children. Don't forget me. Live strongly. These messages, carried down the mountain by rescuers, became sacred artifacts. Families clutched them like relics, as if the words themselves contained the essence of the lost. But what of the words never written? What of the screams that faded into smoke? The prayers left unspoken? Those remain, echoing on Osutaka Ridge, waiting still. To stand at the memorial today is to feel both sorrow and awe. A stone monument rises against the sky, etched with the names of the dead. Visitors leave flowers, toys, photographs, letters. The air is quiet, but it is not empty. Even on bright summer afternoons, when cicadas drone and the sun filters through leaves, there is a weight, a density to the silence. It presses on the skin, reminding you that you stand on ground consecrated not by priests, but by fire and blood. Some say the memorial is enough, that the spirits have found peace, that prayers have lifted them beyond the ridge. Yet each year, new stories surface. Strange lights in the forest, dreams of passengers boarding a plane that never lands, the sound of footsteps following hikers on empty trails. Perhaps peace is not so easily won. Perhaps some spirits have ascended, while others linger. Or perhaps the haunting itself is the form of their memory, an eternal reminder carved into the world, so that the living never forget the night the sky fell. And so the story begins, not just with a crash, but with a haunting that stretches across decades. This is not a tale to be read quickly or dismissed as superstition. It is a tapestry woven of history, grief, and ghostly presence. In the chapters that follow, we will walk deeper into the forest of Osutaka Ridge. We will listen to the voices that echo there, explore the strange encounters that blur the line between the living and the dead, and witness the rising tide of supernatural unease that coils around the mountain. For the ghosts of Flight 123 are not gone. They wait, they whisper, and the deeper one listens, the clearer their voices become. The ridge does not sleep. By day it hides beneath sunlight, feigning calm, its trees bowing gently to mountain winds, its soil softened by moss and leaves. But when twilight bleeds into night, the ridge awakens, the shadows lengthen, the air thickens, and the silence grows so heavy it seems to press against the skin of anyone who dares approach. For those who know the story of Flight 123, the silence is not absence, it is listening. The mountain listens, and in that listening, the dead begin to stir. In the months after the crash, long before the memorial stone was raised, Villagers who lived nearest to Osutaka Ridge began to whisper of strange occurrences. They said the air above the mountain glowed faintly at night, as if hundreds of lanterns floated in procession through the trees. Some claimed these were fireflies, but others swore the lights were too large, too bright, too deliberate, like spirits carrying their own candles through the forest. Farmers rose early to tend their fields, reported hearing voices before dawn. It sounded like chanting, one old man recalled, like 100 people praying in the distance. But when I climbed the ridge to look, the forest was empty. Another woman swore she heard the sound of a child calling for her mother, carried on the wind, but when she followed the sound it faded, leaving only the rustle of leaves. At first the people told no outsiders. In Japan, the supernatural is not entertainment, it is truth woven into the fabric of daily life. To admit hearing the dead is not madness, but acknowledgement of the world's unseen half. Still, they feared being mocked. They kept their stories within the village, murmured at night like secrets too heavy for daylight. The rescue workers, however, could not remain silent. Many of them were young men, soldiers and firefighters hardened by drills, but unprepared for the horror of 500 burned and broken bodies. They carried the corpses down the mountain wrapped in tarps, stepping carefully to avoid the still smoking wreckage. And yet, even as they worked, they swore the mountain resisted. One man told of a hand that gripped his ankle as he reached for a body. "I looked down," he said years later, "and there was nothing, no one alive, only the dead. But I felt it, fingers cold and desperate. They didn't want me to leave them there." Another rescuer collapsed in tears after hearing what he believed to be whispers in his ear. The words were too faint to understand, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, sorrowful, clinging. "I wasn't alone," he admitted. "They were all around me, watching, begging." For weeks after the mission ended, nightmares plagued the men. They dreamed of standing in rows before a great, burning plane, unable to move as hundreds of faceless passengers reached toward them. Some awoke screaming, drenched in sweat, certain they had heard real voices outside their windows. Their families, frightened, brought priests to cleanse their homes. Incense burned, sutras chanted, but the shadows lingered still. The monks who came to Osutaka Ridge to perform memorial rituals felt the same. One described the energy there as suffocating. It was like walking into a room filled with sorrow so heavy it had shape. He explained, "The mountain does not breathe like other mountains. It remembers." When they chanted sutras for the dead, strange things occurred. Incense flames flickered sideways. Though no wind blew, bells rang without being touched. On one occasion, the voice of a monk cracked and faltered as he recited prayers. He later confessed that he had felt a hand press against his throat, as if a passenger were trying to use his voice to speak. These were not isolated stories. They accumulated, layering one upon another, until the ridge became infamous. Journalists arrived, curious about rumors of hauntings. Some dismissed them as grief-fueled hallucinations, but others went home pale and shaken, whispering of strange presences in their hotel rooms after visiting the site. One reporter woke to find his bedsheets soaked, though no water source was near. He swore the scent was not of water but of jet fuel. Time, which usually erodes grief, seemed only to sharpen the hauntings. A year passed, then 5, then 10, and still the mountains stirred at night. Travelers spoke of encountering figures on the trails. Businessmen in suits stained with dirt, women clutching handbags, children staring with hollow eyes. Always they vanished when approached, like mist scattered by wind. Taxi drivers became reluctant to accept fares late at night near Gunma. Some told of passengers who entered their cars, silent and pale, requesting rides to Osaka or Haneda Airport. Halfway along the journey, the driver would glance in the rearview mirror and find the seat empty, though the door had never opened. Others said the passenger would vanish only upon reaching their supposed destination, leaving behind no payment, no trace, sometimes not even the weight of having sat in the seat. One driver admitted he quit his job entirely after finding a faint handprint burned into the fabric of his back seat. Following such an encounter, the letters found among the wreckage, the farewell notes, became talismans of both comfort and fear. Families kept them locked in drawers, wrapped in cloth like relics. Some reported that the papers seemed to move on their own, shifting slightly as though breathed upon. A few even claimed to hear the voices of their lost loved ones when they touched the pages, whispering the same words written in hurried scrawl. One widow said that for years after the crash, She heard her husband's voice calling her name every August at dusk, the anniversary of the disaster. She would light incense, bow, and reply aloud, as if he was standing beside her. Only then would the voice fade. She believed it was his spirit returning to check on her, still tethered to the mountain where he perished. As the 20th anniversary approached, the hauntings grew darker. A group of hikers ascending Osutaka Ridge claimed to hear footsteps behind them all the way up. When they reached the summit and turned, they found no one. That night, in their mountain lodge, each of them dreamed the same dream. A massive airplane flying low, flames trailing from its tail, its shadow covering them. Another group of visitors brought cameras to document their memorial pilgrimage. When they developed the film, several frames showed not the memorial stone, but blurred images of people standing behind them, people who had not been present. One figure was unmistakable, a man in a pilot's uniform, his face obscured by shadow. Stories like these spread, turning the ridge into both a site of pilgrimage and fear. Spiritualists declared it one of the most haunted locations in Japan. Paranormal investigators brought recorders and sensors, many of which captured inexplicable anomalies, static-filled voices, cold spots, fluctuations of unseen energy. One tape played back a chilling sound, a chorus of voices crying out in unison, too distorted to decipher, but unmistakably human. The haunting of Flight 123 is unlike ordinary ghost stories. It is not the tale of a single specter bound to a single moment. It is the haunting of an event, an eruption of death so vast that the boundary between life and afterlife fractured. The ridge became a liminal space, neither fully alive nor fully dead, where hundreds of souls hover in perpetual twilight. In Japanese belief, such spirits are called eerie ghosts, whose violent or sudden deaths tether them to the mortal world. But the spirits of Flight 123 are more than eerie. They are a collective haunting, bound not only to the site but to each other. Together they form a presence larger than the sum of individuals, a restless tide of human longing that cannot be easily appeased. And yet, they do not appear only at the ridge. Families of victims speak of visits in dreams, of phones ringing with static on August nights, of mirrors fogging inexplicably. The ghosts travel, reaching for those they loved, reminding them of unfinished words. The haunting radiates outward, as if the ridge itself breathed sorrow into the world beyond. By the time the 30th anniversary arrived, the haunting was considered part of the mountain's identity. Tourists came with offerings and cameras, some out of respect, others out of curiosity. Guides warned them not to speak lightly, not to mock, for the mountain did not forgive disrespect. The few who ignored this advice returned ill, plagued by headaches, nightmares, and unshakable dread. One young man laughed as he posed at the memorial, pretending to scream like a passenger. That night he woke to find his bed shaking violently, though no earthquake was recorded. By morning his voice was hoarse, as if he had been screaming in his sleep. The haunting had become undeniable, woven into local folklore, etched into the memories of all who visited. The ridge was no longer just the site of a crash. It was a threshold, a place where the veil thinned and hundreds of spirits drifted, unseen but not unfelt. This was the rise of the haunting, slow, relentless, inexorable. The mountain had absorbed the screams, the prayers, the last desperate breaths of 520 souls, and it would never release them fully. Not while their stories remained unfinished, not while their voices still searched for ears to hear. The mountain remembers, and the dead still speak. The forest no longer felt like an earthly place. It was as though the crash site of Flight 123 existed in a fracture between worlds, a threshold where the dead lingered, unable to cross and unwilling to let go. The deeper the researchers ventured, the more distorted time became. Hours stretched into something shapeless, and shadows seemed to move with intelligence, slipping just out of sight whenever one tried to focus on them. The mountain itself seemed to breathe, an ancient lung that inhaled sorrow and exhaled despair. Queso, the lead historian of the group, was the first to notice the voices growing sharper. At first they were faint echoes, indistinct murmurs carried by the wind, but by the third night they had grown into full sentences. She swore she heard a man calling for his daughter, his voice cracking with desperation. Another time she heard a child sobbing, the kind of sob that twisted into her bones. She told herself these were tricks of exhaustion, tricks of grief amplified by imagination. But the others began to hear them too. None dared to say it aloud until they sat huddled around the campfire one midnight, the flames throwing long, quivering shadows against the trees. "I heard a woman last night," whispered Yuta, the youngest of the team, his face pale. "She kept asking me, 'Why didn't you save us?' I wanted to tell her I couldn't, that I wasn't even alive when it happened, but she wouldn't stop." The others fell silent. It was not a silence of disbelief, but of recognition, as though each of them had borne a similar visitation but had been too afraid to admit it. The fire popped sharply, and the sounds seemed to echo like a gunshot through the ravine. By the fourth night, the apparitions became visible. They began as wisps of light floating between the trees, like lanterns carried by invisible hands. At first beautiful, they soon revealed their true form. One evening, as Keiko scanned the tree line, she saw a figure step forward. It was a woman, her body fractured, her limbs bent at unnatural angles, her face pale and bruised but her eyes shimmering with tears. She raised one arm, pointing at Keiko, and opened her mouth, though the words came not as sound but as a vibration that struck directly into the mind. "Remember us." Keiko screamed and stumbled backward. When she blinked again, the woman was gone. But in her chest, Keiko felt as though something had been placed there, a fragment of sorrow not her own, now fused into her spirit. She could not breathe without tasting ash. She could not close her eyes without seeing the woman's broken form. The mountain grew crueler with each step. The team began to see wreckage not only in the undergrowth but in their dreams. Twisted metal appeared before their eyes as they slept, glowing red hot, and they awoke, drenched in sweat with the smell of smoke still in their nostrils. They dreamt of being trapped in the fuselage, the ceiling torn away, air rushing out, oxygen masks dangling like useless ornaments. Some dreamt of free fall, of endless screaming, of fire rushing up to meet them. Others dreamt of silence, of the long, cold hours survivors had endured before rescue crews arrived too late. Every morning they awoke more broken, more weary, more haunted. But then came the climax, the moment when the boundary between living and dead collapsed completely. It began with a sound, low and hollow, like the tolling of a bell buried beneath the mountain. The air shivered, the trees leaned inward, as if bowing to some invisible force. A mist rolled in, thick and silver, swallowing the camp in its damp embrace. Within the mist, shadows moved with intention. At first, there were only a few, drifting forms, but then dozens appeared. Then hundreds, a host of spectral figures surrounding the researchers, their faces pale, their bodies marked by burns, bruises, and brokenness. Some looked like passengers still strapped to their seats, others like crew members in torn uniforms, their eyes wide with sorrow. Some carried children, holding them protectively even in death. Keiko's knees buckled. Around her, the others clutched one another, their breaths ragged. But the ghosts did not advance in anger. They simply gathered, forming a circle of memory, their gazes fixed upon the living. One figure stepped forward. It was a man, tall, his business suit shredded, his face bloodied, but his eyes alive with a clarity that pierced through the fog. He looked directly at Keiko, as though she alone had been chosen to receive his words. "You walk where we fell," he said, though his lips never moved. His voice existed in the marrow, not the air. "You carry our silence. You carry our screams." Tears streamed down Keiko's cheeks. "What do you want from us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man raised a hand, and instantly the night transformed. The team was no longer standing in a forest. They were inside the plane itself. Around them, seats rattled. Luggage fell from overhead compartments. The cabin lights flickered violently. The air smelled of fear and fuel, and the sound, the unbearable roar of wind and engines dying, deafened them. They were not spectators. They were inside the final minutes of Flight 123, reliving the catastrophe. The plane shook violently. Passengers clutched one another, prayed aloud, screamed. The researchers staggered through the aisle, unseen by those reliving their deaths, yet feeling every ounce of their terror. A mother shielded her daughter's face. An elderly man clutched his briefcase, his knuckles white. Two lovers held hands, whispering their last words. The plane tilted downward, and the cabin filled with cries that rose higher than any storm. Metal shrieked as though the aircraft itself were alive and dying. And then, an impact. The researchers collapsed into darkness. When their eyes opened, they were back in the forest. But the ghosts had not vanished. They stood closer now, their faces radiant with a sorrow that glowed like fireflies. The air thrummed with voices, overlapping and urgent. Words of despair, words of love, words of confusion. The entire mountain resounded with the collective soul of 520 lost lives. Keiko fell to her knees. She felt her body grow heavy, as though each spirit had placed their grief upon her shoulders. And yet, within that crushing weight, there was also a strange clarity. She understood now why they lingered, not merely because of tragedy, but because they had never been remembered as individuals. Their deaths were numbers, headlines, statistics, but here, in the forest, they were still screaming to be seen, to be known, to be human once more. Suddenly, a voice cut through the Kurosa child's voice, fragile but sharp. "Don't leave us here." The mist thickened, the ground vibrated, the trees groaned as though bending under invisible hands. The researchers clung to one another, unable to move. They had crossed into something they could not escape, the living climax of the dead's unending story. The child's voice echoed long after the mist had begun to thin, lingering like an imprint on the skin. "Don't leave us here." The words nested themselves in Keiko's chest, in Yuta's trembling hands. In every breath, the team inhaled as though the mountain had marked them with invisible ink. The crash site was no longer a ruin of bent metal and scattered memorial offerings. It had transformed into a stage where the living and the dead performed a single, endless act of remembrance, one that would not end even if the survivors ran screaming down the slopes. But no one ran. Their bodies were too heavy, as if the mountain itself had woven threads of grief into their muscles. Instead, they stood amidst the circle of phantoms, waiting for something more, some release, some explanation. The ghosts did not vanish, but instead began to move together, forming a spiral. Figures half-transparent, glowing faintly like smoke touched by moonlight, swayed and turned, their broken forms becoming an endless current that wound around the researchers. It was not violent, it was almost ceremonial. Keiso felt a chill press against her skin as a dozen figures passed close. Each one whispered something directly into her bones, names, prayers, confessions. Some were incoherent, words sliced apart by panic. Others were sharp and unforgettable. "I wasn't ready. Tell my mother I love her. I dreamed of the sea. Why did no one come sooner?" She wanted to cover her ears, but the voices bypassed her senses. They were not sound, they were memories, demanding to be shared. The others began to break. Yuta screamed and collapsed, covering his face, sobbing uncontrollably as if his body had absorbed the final terrors of 100 passengers. Aya, another researcher, staggered into the trees and clawed at the bark, whispering apologies to people who were not there. Two others prayed aloud, their words shaking and incoherent, grasping for any anchor of faith to pull them from the whirlpool. And then came the silence. It fell abruptly like a curtain. The ghosts halted. Every figure turned at once to look at the living, their pale eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. Keiko understood in that instant that the choice had shifted, that the spirits were no longer demanding only remembrance. They wanted something else. The tall man in the shredded suit stepped forward again, his body wavering like a reflection in water. His eyes found Keiko, and though his lips never parted, she felt his words bloom within her mind. "You carry us now." Her heart pounded. "Carry you where?" she whispered. The man lifted a hand and pointed not down the mountain, not into the sky, but directly into her chest, into her soul. She gasped as her vision fractured. For a moment, she was not herself, but every passenger at once. She felt the terror of falling, the sting of fire, the shattering of bones, the quiet acceptance of those who prayed in the last seconds. She felt the patience of the ones who waited in the wreckage for help that never came in time. She felt their love, their rage, their despair all condensed into a single unbearable flame inside her. Keiko collapsed to the ground, convulsing, her mouth open in a scream that produced no sound. The others rushed to her, but none dared to touch her. Her body twisted as if invisible hands pulled her in different directions, as though she were being torn between two realms. The spirits pressed closer, their faces forming a wall of light and shadow around her. And then just as suddenly it stopped. Keiko lay still, her chest heaving, her eyes wide and glassy. She sat up slowly, and her voice, when it came, was not hers. It was hundreds of voices layered into one, deep, high, broken, furious, grieving. "We are still here." The researchers recoiled. Uta fell backward into the dirt. Aya whispered, "Oh God." Keiso stood, her movements jerky, as if her limbs had forgotten how to belong to one body. She looked at her companions, but her gaze carried centuries of exhaustion. "You will leave," the layered voices said, "but you will never escape. We are with you, in your dreams, in your silence, in your breath." The mist collapsed inward, sucking itself into the ground like smoke drawn into hidden vents. The ghosts flickered, their shapes dissolving, until only Keiko remained standing in the circle where hundreds had just been. The forest returned to its natural stillness, but it was a silence that no bird or wind dared to disturb. When the team finally descended the mountain, the sky was pale with dawn. Their bodies felt hollow, their shadows stretched too long on the path. They did not speak. Each step down the slope felt heavier, as though their souls resisted leaving Dot at the base of the mountain. Search crews found them wandering in a daze. Their eyes were red, their clothes damp with mountain dew, their voices cracked from silence. They gave no report of their findings, no explanation of the strange marks carved into the soil near their camp, no account of how the mist seemed to have swallowed their equipment. But Keiso never spoke again. She returned to the city, but her eyes never focused on the living. At night, neighbors heard her whispering names in languages she had never known. Sometimes she laughed in a man's voice. Other times she sobbed like a child. Doctors declared her afflicted by trauma, but no treatment pierced the veil, and the others fared no better. Yuta drowned himself 3 months later. Aya vanished during a return pilgrimage to the mountain. Only her shoes were found at the trailhead. The remaining 2 grew reclusive, scribbling pages of incoherent testimonies before burning them in fits of terror. The mountain stood silent through it all, but hikers still speak of strange cries echoing near the ridge. They speak of lights moving through the trees when no lantern burns, of sudden chills, of laughter that cuts off into screams. Some claim they have met a woman dressed like a historian who asks, "Do you remember Flight 123?" before vanishing into the mist. Then so the haunting continues, not bound by the crash site alone, but carried forward in every soul who dares to remember. The ghosts of Flight 123 have no closure, no grave vast enough to hold their sorrow. They are fragments of fire stitched into the mountain, fragments of voices carried on the wind. Every year, on the anniversary of the crash, offerings are left at the memorial stone. Flowers, bottles of sake, letters folded neatly, but sometimes, hikers find these offerings scattered violently across the ground, as though invisible hands had swatted them away. It is said the spirits resent pity. They do not want mourning, they want presence. They want the living to feel what they felt, if only for a moment. And sometimes, at dusk, when the light is thin and the air smells faintly of smoke, a strange sound carries through the forest. It is not the cry of birds or the rustle of leaves. It is the faint, hollow hum of an engine that should not exist. If you stand very still, you might hear more: the rush of wind, the snap of tearing metal, the final cries of hundreds of souls falling together into fire. And when you turn to leave, you may feel a hand brush against yours, unseen but cold, and a whisper breathing into your ear the words that will follow you down the mountain, into your sleep, and perhaps into your grave. Don't leave us here. The story ends where it began, in silence that is never truly silent. The mountain keeps its ghosts, and the ghosts keep whoever dares to listen.